The issue of investigating terrorism, because I don't know how you stop this, right? I mean, there's no way to, because this is not, we can't clamp down on guns. Can we close the big box store loophole? What do you think? Can we close the big box store loophole? I mean, how can a guy just go rent a pickup truck for $19 from Home Depot and mow people down? How do you predict that this guy was going to do this on this day? How do you predict it? How do you predict that this guy, who's probably not actually connected to ISIS, but was radicalized by propaganda from ISIS, how do you predict that he's going to go off on this day? Couldn't get a gun in New York City, but he still managed to kill 8 people and seriously wound many more. Alex Del Carmen, Dr. Alex Del Carmen, is at Tarleton State University. He's been teaching and advising police departments and others on investigating terrorism for many years. Dr. Del Carmen, thanks for coming on the program this morning. How are you?
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so as we look at this, I don't see how this could have been stopped. Do you?
No, absolutely not. I mean, law enforcement is now faced with the reality that just about anyone in the world can rent a vehicle, as you noted earlier, and simply run that vehicle against innocent people. I mean, how do you stop that?
And I think the thing that should really, I don't want people to be walking around terrified. I do not want that. I mean, we just had Halloween, and one of the reasons I think ISIS called for things to happen on Halloween is because we're all sitting ducks because we're going about our lives, living our lives. But unless you live in a total surveillance state where the government is reading your every email stroke, watching your every Google search, there's simply, and then predicting based on those algorithms what your behaviors are going to be, there simply is no way to intervene with this. I guess we could probably go in and try to put, concrete barriers to protect from cars going down bike lanes, but the expenses involved in trying to set that up, I mean, is just impossible.
Yeah, and then part of the problem is that if you look at the past 10, 20 years of how we have been attacked, by terrorists, I mean, they seem to have a pretty wild imagination, and they also seem to evolve in the way that they think they're going to harm us, right? So they start with bombs, they strap themselves with bombs, then they use rifles, then they use guns. Now they're using vehicles. I mean, if we stop the vehicles, hypothetically, if there was a way that we could do that, they're going to get into motorcycles. They're going to get into bicycles. And
right.
So at the end of the day, when you have somebody that wants to harm you, they're going to do it anyway.
Yeah, in England right now, they're having a problem because they've basically taken away everything else, knives, guns, etc. So they're using mopeds and acid. And, and they're doing acid douse attacks on people as they're walking down the street. So let's talk about how we combat this crazy ideology. How do we, because I want people to be able to come here from all over the world, escape oppression. I want moderate Muslims to be able to leave these countries where ISIS is taking over their country and destroying their faith and destroying their lives and forcing them to do things they don't want to do. I want them to be able to escape from that and make a better life for themselves. But also, we do have to have a stronger idea and a stronger sense of our own personal sovereignty as a nation for who's coming in from countries around the world that are hotbeds of this, at least in severely vetting them. I mean, is that not a common sense thing for us to do?
Yeah, but I mean, in addition to that, how do you stop them from being radicalized once they get to the United States?
Yeah.
And so the bottom line is you can let somebody in that shows you that they're good people, that they love America, that they want to be here. And then 10, 20, 50, 25 years later, they're going to start reading all this junk on the Internet and then turn around and harm our people. So at the end of the day, how do you stop that process from taking place?
All right. As an advisor, what are you telling police departments today? What are you telling your students today about fighting terrorism in the future?
Back when 9/11 took place, President Bush called a whole bunch of Hollywood producers and people from all walks of life to start thinking about how the terrorists could actually harm us. I think we're at that point right now where we have to start thinking about things that we typically don't think about. And what I tell law enforcement is we've got to fall outside of our norm. We've got to get out of our comfort zone and think about ways that they can harm innocent people that have not been traditionally the way that they harm us in the past. And that's what we have to do. We have to take this to the next level and begin to think like the Israelis do, begin to think about how it is that people can harm us in our simplest ways in the modern day America that we live in.
Well, I also think that I think going along with what you're saying, I think part of this is going to rely on the individual as well. You know, we had the big "See Something, Say Something" campaign, and I think that's part of it. But I also think that as Americans, we don't want to, you know, the terrorists failed to stop the big Halloween party in New York last night. And that was classic vintage New York. And I love that. You know, they said, screw it. We're going to have our party anyway. We're going to have our parade. You're not going to stop us. And that's one of the things that all Americans love about New York being one of our big representative cities of our nation is that sort of stalwart, that stubbornness that, you know, you can't get us down. But I also think we need to get better as citizens of looking over our shoulder just a little bit, not in a paranoid way, but what is our situational awareness? You know, what are my vulnerabilities as I walk through the mall? What are my vulnerabilities as I go down this bike path? Do you agree with that? That Americans need to become more situationally aware to try to minimize the impact of inevitable attacks like this?
Yeah, I mean, there's no question. Look at what happened in Vegas a few months ago. I mean, you had people that were being shot at and were walking around worried about whether or not they were going to spill their drink. I mean, you could see that on the video.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yes.
There are people in America today that they have absolutely no sense of what kind of threat we're under on a daily basis. But at the same time, we also have to be careful that we obviously don't make Americans panic to the extent that we lose the fiber of what makes us Americans, right? So there's that fine line that you have to walk between those two.
Yeah, I think you're right, and you were talking about the people walking around afraid they were going to spill their drink. There was also the famous video of the guy. Shots are ringing out over his head. People are down on the ground around him, and he's pulling out his phone to take a video because, you know, I got to make sure I get my Facebook post up. It's like, dude, get out of that situation. You know, I totally agree with you. It's a tough day, I think, for Americans. What piece of advice would you leave? If there's police forces listening, if there's individuals listening to this conversation that we've had, that would encourage them not to be panicked, but also to try to be a part of the solution?
You know, one of the great things about the United States is that we have the best people in the world and we have the best law enforcement in the world. I mean, the FBI, NYPD, and various other law enforcement across the nation are amazing people, and they do a great job. But Americans have to basically enlist themselves. They have to help law enforcement out. As you pointed out earlier, if something doesn't look right, it's probably because it's not right.
Right.
And so at that point, you need to report it to authorities and make it happen.
Yeah.
Situational awareness has to be there, and we have to work with law enforcement, not against them.
All right, listen, thank you, Dr. Alex Del Carmen. We appreciate your time this morning.
Of yesterday's terror attack from Dr. Alex Del Carmen, who heads up the School of Criminology, Criminal Justice, and Strategic Studies at Tarleton State University in Fort Worth, Texas. He has taught anti-terrorism tactics for the last 16 years. He also works with police departments from coast to coast on training and tactics. Alex, your initial reaction as you started hearing details?
You know, unfortunately, Gordon, this is more of the same what we've seen in the past few years throughout the world and in some parts of the United States. And sadly, you know, we had predicted that it was going to happen in New York City at some point. It was a matter of time. So I wasn't really shocked, but I was obviously saddened for not only the lives that were lost, but those individuals that are still at the hospital recovering.
There's really no way to stop this type of thing?
You know, it's going to be very difficult for law enforcement to be able to do this. I mean, we can do certain things, but at the end of the day, you know, how can you stop an individual from getting into a commercial or a regular vehicle and driving that vehicle into a crowd? You know, weaponizing cars is not something that law enforcement has been trained to do.
Can you train law enforcement to recognize that? That to me seems like an impossibility.
It is an impossibility. I mean, there are some things. Obviously, let's say you have a police officer in an outer perimeter of a parade or, you know, some sort of a rock concert or an event. You know, you can always train officers to spot the car that seems to be headed in the wrong direction. But then you could also have people that naturally get lost or that, you know, may pull to the side of the road. So how are you going to stop that?
All right. So this is, you know, really on the heels of Las Vegas also. I mean, are we heading into a stretch where we're looking at potential copycat type crimes? Not that New York was a copycat of Vegas, but I mean, it's one terror incident after another.
There is no question. And look, at the end of the day, the best thing for terrorists to learn from is how we react to them, to these events, and whether or not we can prevent them. You know, I'm sure there are individuals across the United States right now that have been radicalized, that are waiting for their cue to inflict terror on other innocent bystanders, and they're looking at this event. They're saying, "Oh, wow, so that worked." And what did he do? And how did he approach the individuals that were riding a bicycle? And how did he kill people? And so they're taking notes, and they're getting better and better every time something like this happens. It's very, very sad for America.
We're speaking with Dr. Alex Del Carmen. He heads up the School of Criminology, Criminal Justice, and Strategic Studies at Tarleton State University in Fort Worth, Texas. We're talking about the terror attack in New York City. So you mentioned that the terrorists sometimes watch how we react and what we say. I think the comments from Mayor de Blasio in New York City were fairly strong in that he said this is not going to deter us from going about our daily lives, and I think he encouraged New York City residents to do so. Does that matter? Does that resonate to a terrorist?
Not really. I mean, at the end of the day, they want to inflict pain and they want to inflict terror on all of us, and they obviously want us to stop living the way we live our lives, right? They want us to be fearful. They want us to make long lines, to be able to get into a mall, to be screened, and all of that. So, yes, to the extent that we can fight them psychologically by saying we're not going to stop our way of life. You look at the Israelis, for instance, every time they get attacked, they have a crew of people coming in overnight to basically reconstruct the scene and make sure that in the morning it looks as if the terrorist attack never took place. The idea is to go back to that terrorist and basically say, you don't matter enough that we're going to change our way of life. But bottom line, though, is they're going to continue to attack us because they're all about the endurance. Look, from their perspective, this is a marathon. This is not a sprint.
So what do we do in the meantime as Americans as we, occasionally count victims on occasion, Alex?
Well, sadly, being an American is going to come with a price for our generation, those generations to come. And what that means is we're going to have to be situationally aware. We're going to have to live our lives freely, as we always have, but at the same time, being cautious of what surrounds us. And anytime we see something that is out of the ordinary, that doesn't look right, that doesn't feel right, let authorities know. I know sometimes people see that as a cliche, but at the end of the day, that's the way we're going to have to live our lives and train our children to live their lives in the future.
Is that what you mean by situationally aware?
Right. So being able to be aware of what surrounds us, right? So if there's a car coming at a crowd, be able to understand what you're going to do. If the channels of communication are going to be interrupted, be able to understand what are going to be the approaches to be able to communicate with family and loved ones. Unfortunately, that is the new paradigm of the United States now, where we're headed.
Thanks, Alex. Alex Del Carmen from Tarleton State University in Fort Worth.
This is the Tom Becca program. Starting November, the day after Halloween. Glad you are a part of it. And yesterday there was a terrorist attack in New York City. 8 people lost their lives. Joining me right now is Dr. Alex Del Carmen. He's an anti-terrorism expert. He is the head of the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice and Strategic Studies at Tarleton State University in Fort Worth. Dr. Del Carmen, thanks for joining us. Can you start off here? Because we were getting this discussion before you joined us. Just really, what is the definition of terrorism? Why is this considered a terrorist attack, for instance, and the Las Vegas shooting is not?
Well, good morning, and thanks for having me this morning. Typically, when you look at terrorism as a definition, there are obviously, not one or two, but dozens of definitions of terrorism. But we typically adhere to the one that's given to us by the FBI, which is the one that's universally accepted. And what that relates to is the idea that the individual that inflicts harm on other people has to have an ideology, obviously based on which is the basis of the actual terror or the violence. And so in this case, in New York, we understand that there are signs the individual exhibited when committing the crime, and now the FBI has taken the lead on this investigation, and they reassure us that it's a definition of terrorism.
Okay, but if we take a look at, and I found these figures kind of shocking, to be honest with you. Since 9/11, only 95 people have died on American soil due to terrorism. I found that to be kind of surprising, because I would have thought that it would have been substantially higher, and I think most people would think it would be substantially higher. How serious is the real terrorism threat in America?
So, America is a vast country, right? So when you look at an attack on New York, where, as tragic as it is that a number of people died, I mean, obviously, most people in the United States don't feel that's going to be affecting their lives today. Having said that, though, it's still a reality that we have to live with, and we just don't know when the next attack is going to be. And sort of the mystery of this whole incident is the fact that the people that were riding a bicycle on a nice afternoon in New York City yesterday had no idea that they were going to be the subject of that statistically, seldom act of terror that happens on U.S. soil. So bottom line is it can happen to anybody.
Well, you're right. I mean, it could happen to anybody. There could have been a person driving down the street who went into a diabetic shock, lost control of their car, and killed as many people just as well, right? That were riding their bicycles. So you're right. I mean, you never know. At any given time, anything could happen. But then we get into this whole thing about fear. And that's what I think is sort of interesting about all of this, because when we've got, the thought of terrorism, I'm getting texts from people that say we need to send all the Muslims out of the country. We got the president saying we got to vet more, do more extreme vetting before we let anybody into the country. And I'm not so sure that any of those are even reasonable solutions, let alone ones that would have any major effect. What do you think about the whole extreme vetting process?
Well, I think at the end of the day, what often happens when we see an act of terror on our soil and really anywhere in the world is we act with a lot of emotion, right? So we have an emotional reaction, that sometimes it's almost illogical, right? And politicians obviously take advantage of that and they try to inflict fear on other people to try to push their agenda. So whichever that agenda may be, I think it makes sense for us to be able to make sure that we don't allow ISIS individuals that have a card that says I belong to ISIS on U.S. soil, right? But at the same time, it's also important for us to ensure that we're not discriminated against people from a particular part of the world or that look a certain way because of the fact that we fear anyone that doesn't look like us. And so somewhere in between, there's common sense, and that's simply what we have to adhere to. But when is the last time that you thought that the government or politicians ever solved any of our issues, right? So.
Well, I think you said it right there, common sense, and I agree. You don't want to let people in there with known ISIS ties and known terrorism ties, or known people that want to do anybody in the United States harm. You don't want to let them into the country. I thoroughly agree with that. Okay, and so far we've done a pretty good job of that, considering the number of terrorist attacks we've had on American soil since 9/11. But to your point here, to your point about the extreme vetting and everything, the guy that did this. The low-life scumbag that did this, it appears, the reports are, that he was radicalized on American soil. And I've heard the stories about how this is a bigger problem in places like France and, Europe, because they are less likely to let, people from other countries assimilate into their country. And therefore, they've got a bigger terrorist problem than we have here in the United States, because we are more accepting, generally speaking, of people of different faiths, different countries, and different beliefs. In your studies, have you found that to be the case?
A few weeks ago, I was in London, and I was leaving the train station in London, just a few miles away from where the last bomb exploded in London, almost to the minute. I was leaving London to Cardiff to Wales when that happened, and he sort of, when it hits you that personally, and you kind of think about it, that could have been you. I mean, you start thinking, what makes Europe more vulnerable than the United States? And one of the things that we see, obviously, is that in Europe, there's a great deal of movement within the European continent among countries. I mean, anybody who's been to Europe will tell you that, the train stations are there. You don't have to show a passport to go from one country to the next. I mean, there's really no security at all when you get on board a train. And so from a security standpoint, it's not difficult to imagine that somebody can inflict that level of terror and really cause pain and the loss of life on any of these train stations or anything like that. So more so than just the ethnic and the acclimation and the assimilation of people, that probably will be explained, 20, 50 years down the road. I think it's way too early for us to determine that. The bottom line is the vulnerabilities exist over there because of the freedom of movement that does exist among countries, which we in the United States and other parts of the Americas don't have.
Well, no, but actually we do. I mean, you talk about the freedom of movement. You've got people that can, once they come into the country, right, they can go from state to state. They can get on trains. They can get on buses. They can, put themselves in situations that would be, terrorist oriented. And we don't see that many terrorist attacks, considering how many, millions of Muslims are in the country, and that we don't see that many terrorist attacks in this country. So it is sort of the same sort of thing, isn't it?
No, not really. I mean, you can't compare coming in, going from New York to New Hampshire or, Boston, that freedom of movement from going from Italy to Spain and onward to England. I mean, bottom line is these are different countries that have different policies in admitting people to their own countries. And so my point is that we don't depend on another nation to let people in that may be questionable. We basically are able to draft that policy as to who we allow in the United States and we don't. And once they're inside the United States, yeah, I agree with you. They are able to move freely from one state to the next, but not among countries as you do have in Europe. And I think that that's one of their biggest weaknesses is that when you look at, for instance, what the admissions policy to go into Spain from Morocco is, it's very different from the policy that the French may have as to what allows them to migrate from other parts of Europe. And so once you go into the European continent, because of the European Union agreement, you're allowed to move freely within Europe, really without showing a passport. And that's my point, that those vulnerabilities, they pass on from one country to the next.
I see, but I guess my question was almost more along the lines, though, about the radicalization once they're on on that soil, because many of the terrorist attacks that have happened in Europe have happened after somebody was radicalized once they were, living in England or wherever they may be. They were radicalized once they were in that country. And my point was that it's easier to radicalize once they're on soil, on some other country's soil, if that other country is not going to let them assimilate and be a part of that country. That was sort of the point I was trying to make, as opposed to
and I think that,
no terrorists going from country to country.
True. Yeah, no, that may be true. But I also think that one of the things to think about as well is that radicalization takes place at all levels, and it doesn't really just happen in Europe or only in America. I mean, anytime people have a computer and access to the internet, and they're intellectually curious about what that other group may represent, they begin to work those issues. And keep in mind, too, that a lot of people that are radicalized, sometimes they don't even officially belong to that entity. They're sort of wannabes. They're people that are just simply, they get in their car, they go out, commit a terrorist act, they say, I'm doing it on behalf of such and such group. Well, the such and such group may not even know that they exist. And so that does happen across the globe, sadly.
Yeah, they want to be members of ISIS, although they may not have any real connection to ISIS, and that's I mean, either way people die. So I'm not trying to say that's not that big a deal, but you're right. They may not actually be connected to the core of the terrorist organization. Dr. Alex Del Carmen, I appreciate your input here and your insight here. Dr. Del Carmen is the head of the School of Criminology, Criminal Justice, and Strategic Studies at Tarleton State University in Fort Worth. Have a great day, sir. Thanks for being a part of the program.
Authorities say this was a man in a rented box truck mowing down bicyclists on a busy path. And joining us live now to talk about this attack, we bring back Dr. Alex Del Carmen, the executive director of the School of Criminology at Tarleton State University. Dr. Del Carmen, thanks so very much for joining us again.
Yes, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Wanted to get your general thoughts first off on what do you see and what happened here in the last couple of hours in New York City?
Well, our hearts and prayers go out to the families who lost loved ones today. But unfortunately, this is more of the same of what we've seen in Europe and even in the United States in the past couple of years. I mean, it's got every single ingredient of a terrorist attack. So I'm not surprised that the New York officials just called it that.
Do you think today being Halloween plays a role in this?
Well, possibly. I mean, one of the things that you have to begin to question is their timing, right? So we know that, for instance, last year or 2 years ago, ISIS posted a commentary on their website, on one of their websites, about, attacking U.S. soil in New York during this time of the year. So it's not surprising at all that they would do that. And remember that the terrorist objective is to inflict terror on Americans, and there's nothing better than to do so during these special times of the year.
There are reports that this attacker may have targeted that school bus that was involved in this crash. Is that sort of a new page in the playbook of these terrorists?
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that attacking children on U.S. soil may be new to us in America. But if you look at terrorism in general, all over Europe and even in places like Russia, when you look at the Chechnyan suicide bombers, they have for years targeted schools and targeted children. So this is out of the playbook of Terrorism 101, when you actually see that they're going to be attacking the most vulnerable population in our midst and those that they know are going to anger us twice as much as they would otherwise.
The fact that this suspect survived and we understand is hospitalized, how much information can the authorities potentially get out of him as to something perhaps larger than what happened today?
So, it depends, right? It depends on the level of radicalization. It depends on whether or not this person is actually going to talk at some point. But for me, I'm more hopeful than for them to get information from him, that they're going to be getting and obtaining information as I speak to you right now from his social media, web sources, from his telephone, from his driver's license. I'm sure the FBI knows exactly where this person is from, how many times he's been overseas, and what type of terrorism links he has, and whether or not, frankly, other people helped him.
Dr. Del Carmen, we always appreciate your expertise. That's Dr. Alex Del Carmen from Tarleton State University.